The rising global tensions which are now hitting home, inflation climbing faster than expected, energy bills set to increase again, and warnings of possible food shortages in the months ahead as the war in the Middle East continues to disrupt oil and gas supplies. There are growing concerns about what this means for Irish households, the wider economy and the road ahead. And joining me now to break it all down in studio, I have Tommy Corbett from Carey Corbett Financial Solutions, and also with us is the Newmarket-on-Fergus native and Professor of Politics at DCU, Donnacha Ó'Beacháin. And you're both very welcome to the programme. And Donnacha, I might start with yourself. I suppose we saw the recent fuel protests and everything that happened here really made it hit home to people who can sometimes, you can watch stuff on the news and feel a bit disconnected from it, but we could see the direct impacts of that. And this conflict really is directly impacting inflation, energy, and maybe we'll touch on it a little later on, potentially food supply as well. This is a serious global fallout.
Oh, absolutely, Alan, and good morning. Look, there's uncertainty about the duration, about the intensity, about the direction of this war, and markets hate uncertainty. It's disrupting supply chains, and therefore there's a risk of global recession the longer that this conflict endures. I think what we've seen in the last 50 days plus is that what started as a military war has now in many respects become an economic war. I mean, this is Iran's trump card, essentially. They cannot beat the Americans militarily. That's quite clear. It's a very asymmetrical war. But the Strait of Hormuz, which I think the vast majority of the Irish electorate and indeed global population didn't know much about before this war, they now realise that 20% of the global oil supplies are going through that region, and Iran can disrupt that. And disrupting the kind of objectives of your enemy is, from Iranians' perspective, it's a victory of sorts. So that's why you had Donald Trump, several weeks ago saying that this war was effectively over. If you go back to the 9th of March, for example, he said the war is very complete, pretty much. And here we are several weeks later, and he's petitioning really the Iranians to negotiate in Pakistan. The White House has announced that there will be negotiations, that J.D. Vance is on his way to Islamabad. It's the Iranians who are saying they're not sure whether they'll turn up because the American demands are excessive. And of course, you've had this attack on the Iranian cargo ship during the last 24 hours.
And just to bring you in, Tommy, I mean, inflation is part of this. We know the European Central Bank targets around 2% inflation, but inflation across the Eurozone now takes it up to 2.6%, which I guess is driven largely by the energy cost linked to the war. How significant is that jump, and could that be just the beginning?
Yeah, I think so. Good morning, Donnacha. Good morning, Alan. I suppose the Eurozone want to keep inflation at 2%. The fact that it's rising, at 2.6% is not too bad, but I think the shock that we had back after the COVID pandemic, when inflation rose to 10, 11% in the Eurozone, and I think central banks felt that they probably reacted a little bit too slowly at that stage. I think they're going to be a lot quicker to react now, and I think you are looking at the probability of interest rate rises in the Eurozone, which will have a knock-on effect into people's borrowings, the likes of variable rate mortgages, fixed rates into the future, that kind of thing, and that obviously then will impact consumers' day-to-day spending habits, etc.
We're hearing, electricity bills could rise again with gas prices surging. How much pressure can households realistically absorb at this point?
Yeah, I think in general we're not in such a bad place, because I think Ireland has performed very well economically over the last number of years. I think there's a lot of household savings there, and we're not massively in debt, as a country. However, there are going to be areas of the economy and areas of certain consumers that are going to be hit hardest, and it will have a knock-on effect then in the overall economy, and that uncertainty generally leads to a lack of spend because of dented confidence. So basically, if people think that prices are going to increase, they're not going to spend like they normally will.
And I suppose it's one thing, Donnacha, we saw how much, I suppose, disruption and concern was caused during the recent fuel protests and service stations running out of fuel. But the UN warning of potential food shortages, it's taken it up another couple of notches. If people start to see empty shelves or even rising food prices in countries like our own, it's going to become extremely, extremely difficult. And I don't know, will that put more pressure on the US to try and negotiate some sort of conclusion? Can other countries, I was going to say allies, maybe former allies at this point, lean on them to try and bring this thing to a resolution before we do see empty shelves on a long-term basis?
Well, unfortunately for us, perhaps, the US is relatively well insulated from the results, at least in a comparative context. It is relatively resource rich, and therefore, it would be several months before I think it would have an immediate imperative. But I think it's what's clear to me is that, Donald Trump and his administration want out of this war, but they want out of this war in a way that they can spin as a victory, as meeting some kind of baseline objective. So that's the positive in this. I don't think that the US is in this for the long haul. This is not going, because they don't want to simply commit troops. They don't want a land invasion. So it's really a question of whether the Iranians will play ball and give the Americans enough that they can take away from this as a victory. I think the big victims will be actually not ourselves in Ireland or in Europe generally. It'll be mainly in the global south. They're not as well insulated from these economic shocks. Some parts of the world, like Japan, for example, in terms of their resources, they have supplies lasting for over a year. They can withstand an economic shock for over a year. We're not as well stocked up in Ireland, but we are. I saw, for example, 6 weeks away from us having a major shortage of jet fuel. And there are already airlines, including Aer Lingus, which have cancelled flights because they're no longer economic now to operate. And we may see an intensification of that in the coming months.
Yeah, and we will be discussing the impending shortage of jet fuel with the travel expert Owen Corey later on in the show. But just before I bring Tommy back in, that point about the US looking for an off-ramp and I suppose for Donald Trump to spin some sort of victory from this whole conflict or war, how likely are the Iranians to play ball on that though, Donnacha, given the nature of the attack from the US and Israel last summer, and then the surprise attack again at the start, which has led to this war? I wouldn't surprise many if the Iranians weren't in such a charitable mood or to a mood to help Donald Trump put a PR spin on this, and maybe they potentially want to humiliate him.
That's always a possibility. I mean, this is a relatively new leadership because the Americans decapitated the political elite in the early stages of the war. And, after that, a new leadership, took on the reins and they are, as you say, not necessarily in the mood to accommodate the US administration. And of course, you have the kind of the joker in the pack, which is Israel, because even though the United States may think it has reached an agreement with Iran, Israel's objectives in Lebanon are already putting that kind of agreement under strain. This 2-week ceasefire will come to an end soon. So the prospects for a negotiated ceasefire, I still think, are rather high, because I think there is an imperative, I think, still in the US that they'd like to get out of this quickly. The Iranians have survived this, so I think that they will be able to spin this as well. I think the tragedy in many respects is that we will go back to a situation where the Strait of Hormuz being open will be, presented as a major victory for the United States when its opening was never in question before this war. So we've had the deaths of thousands of people essentially to bring us to a situation which is no better than we were when we started.
And Tommy, I've mentioned the fuel protests and obviously the measures, the €505 million support package that was announced by the government on foot of those protests. And one of the many questions which were raised during discussions about it, that on Morning Focus was, well, once unions saw what results these protests could glean, they were going to come looking for their slice of the pie, and so it has proved. Last Friday, the Taoiseach Taoiseach ministers meeting with trade union and employer representatives at the Labour Employer Economic Forum at government buildings. There's going to be more meetings to secure measures to support workers in the next 4 to 6 weeks, according to IC2. But they do say strikes are inevitable if the government doesn't listen. Have the government made a rod for their own backs with those measures in response to the protest? The unions are always going to come looking for more for their members, and the government can't. They might try to play the poor mouth on this, especially because they have just coughed up 505 million. They'll say they have even less now, but it isn't going to wash.
Yeah, I think they kept capitulated a little bit too quickly in light of the protests there in the last couple of weeks, and they do what they've always done. They throw money at the problem. I think that's what they're going to do again.
And hope it'll go away.
But the problem is these things don't go away, because while they seem like one-off expenditure pieces, they tend to kind of fall into year and year. And basically what happens is the ordinary taxpayer ends up paying for these things anyway. So what they should do and what they will do are two different things. I think what they should do is take their time and see. This hopefully will not be a long-lasting situation where we will get oil prices, gas prices back to normal levels, hopefully over the next 3 to 6 months. That remains to be seen, obviously. But I think what they will do, as I said, they'll do what they've always done. They'll just throw money at it, and we're in a lucky position that Ireland economically is in a very strong position, and they can do that. But I don't think it's the right thing to do.
How do you expect this to proceed? I mean, they said there'll be more talks in the next 4 to 6 weeks. But it doesn't. It seems that the unions aren't going to take no for an answer. So the government is going to have to find more money for them. How significant a sum do you expect that to be, roughly? And what impact is that then going to have on budget 2027 and the reports, I've mentioned this before, that they were cognizant of the disquiet amongst middle class about how they feel like they get nothing, and that there was going to be, I suppose, a few things thrown their way come October, but maybe there is less room to do that, which again could lead to those disgruntled middle class voices getting even louder. Yeah,
it's hard to know what way it's going to proceed. In fairness, the relationship between unions and government has worked really well over the last 20, 25, 30 years, where they have gone into agreements, and that basically has kept expenditure, to a level that is affordable for the country. If we see strikes, if we see protests like we've seen in the last couple of weeks, I do think that the government is going to have to do something. What they're going to have to do, though, I think should be the bare minimum. I think this is a temporary thing, and I think it's probably, if they can do something maybe on a temporary fix, that would probably be the best way to proceed. If they're looking at pay rises, that kind of thing, that falls into a year-on-year expenditure, which will have a knock-on effect down, over the next number of years, and it will have a knock-on effect on this year's budget and budgets into the future. What I will say is this government is probably really only in their first year, maybe first year and a half, so they do have another maybe 3.5 years to play with figures and that kind of thing. But how they're going to proceed is hard to know. I do think that there will be negotiations, obviously, and I do think that the unions are in a strong position given what happened with the process last week.
Yeah, which obviously they are going to point to at every turn. Donnacha, you mentioned the potential negotiations this evening. Donald Trump saying his representatives have travelled to Pakistan again. But if Tehran is reportedly not sending a delegation, it sounds like it's doomed from the start. And even if they do, J.D. Vance's previous trip there produced nothing from 16 hours of talks. The ceasefire is due to expire on Wednesday, so it is coming to a head. You could even question whether that was truly a ceasefire, because it wasn't as easy as maybe ships would have hoped to get through the Straits of Hormuz with this ceasefire in place. So where do we go from here?
Well, I think what we've discovered is that escalation is easy on both sides, but a decisive victory is probably going to be elusive also for both sides. So we may see a negotiated settlement in the coming weeks, but I think it will be an unstable settlement because the structural underpinnings which brought this to a head will remain unchanged. And of course, there won't have been regime change in Iran as the US hoped. And Donald Trump will still remain the unpredictable leader of the United States. So I think that we could see an unstable settlement followed by a prolonged kind of Cold War, which may occasionally overheat. So I'm not particularly optimistic about the prospects because, as I said, the major structural aspects which brought this conflict to a head remain unchanged as it is now. And there's no prospect of that changing in the future. I think that the big dynamic, of course, also to consider is that with Donald Trump facing congressional elections later this year, it has seen a fracturing of his support base at home. This is good news, I think, for many who are worried about this unstable US foreign policy, because it's now considered, even by his own most enthusiastic supporters, inevitable that he will lose the House of Representatives. This was a very unpopular war from the start. Usually US presidents prepare their electorates for war and then go to war. This came out of the blue. The electorate weren't in favour of it. Any support support base wasn't in favour of it. And you've seen him pick unnecessary fights in recent times, including with Pope Leo in Rome. And that, of course, has also had effects among his kind of MAGA Christian support base. So I think that the major impact in the longer term may be political, and that will have an economic impact as well, because, of course, the economic situation is very much following the politics, which is unstable globally at the moment.
And just to finish with you, Tommy, rising inflation, energy shocks, global uncertainty, are we heading toward a recession? Can we possibly avoid it? Does something have to change soon in order for that to happen?
I think it's everything is pointing towards a global recession at this stage. I think it's probably unavoidable. How long it'll last really is down to how long the conflict will last in the Middle East and in around the Strait of Hormuz. But I think everything is pointing to a global recession with inflation, as you said, with supply shortages, with with blockages in relation to the supply chains, that kind of thing. It's looking that way.
Okay, so some sobering news for our listeners of a Monday morning. My thanks to Tommy Corbett of Carey Corbett Financial Solutions and Professor of Politics at DCU, Donnacha Ó'Beacháin, for joining us on Monday's Morning Focus.